it's also a great honor for me to present our two speakers. Now, I must emphasize that while I introduce Dr. Tamra Wright, it's her words, not mine. I would never say this word. So just to emphasize, because Dr. Tamra Wright has been obsessed with the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas for over 40 years. Not my words. I'm sorry about that. It's not my words. Yeah, but still. And her first academic publication, The Paradox of Morality, an interview with Emmanuel Levinas, remains still an important resource for Levinas scholars across the world. I've also seen it and learned a lot from it. Thank you. Especially those interested in animal ethics and post-Holocaust Jewish thought. That's where I come into the picture. She's the author of The Twilight of Jewish Philosophy, Emmanuel Levinas' Ethical Hermeneutics, and co-editor of Face to Face with Animals, Levinas and the Animal Question, as well as a collection of essays on Levinas and Shakespeare. She has held leadership positions, lectureships, and visiting research fellowships at Oxford, Cambridge, King's College London, the School of Oriental and African Studies, YU, and the London School of Jewish Studies. Again, positioning me between Miriam and Dr. Tamra Wright is a bit humbling when it comes to my experience in English. I even have a Midwestern American accent, which is, I might as well milk a cow. Tamra currently balances her academic research with running resilience workshops for faith-based leaders. She is primarily based in London, but spends several months each year in Israel. And today she's here to present us with her talk. Dr. Wright, please.
I'm really excited to be here. And not only because the main reason I came to Israel was for my son to get married 2 weeks ago. So that was a good reason. Thank you, thank you. I love speaking to a Jewish audience because you can share whatever you feel like and people are happy. I am going to ask my watch to give me a 5-minute warning of when I should...
You have 30 minutes.
I know, thank you. 5-minute warning of when I should stop talking because there may or may not be some ad-libbing involved. So as I said, really excited to be here. I've never had so much laughter from an introduction to me before, and I appreciate that, so thank you for that. I'm not embarrassed about the 40 years, and in fact, it's actually coming up to a 40th anniversary of the day that I and 2 friends from the University of Warwick traipsed off to Paris to interview Emmanuel Levinas in his home. And that's the interview that was subsequently published as The Paradox of Morality. As I said, there might be some ad-libbing, so a quick aside. I was at a Friday night dinner at my son's house in Tel Aviv a couple of years ago, and as is, I think, quite normal, a lot of people were sort of drifting off on the couch. You've experienced that sometimes, that people get a bit sleepy. And I was chatting to the person next to me, and I sort of said casually, well, you know, when I interviewed Emmanuel Levinas, and suddenly one of the sleeping beauties woke up and said, like, shocked, you know, she was totally shocked and amazed. You interviewed Emmanuel Levinas? It was like I came to her from the ancient world or something. But anyway, yeah, so it was 40 years ago in August that 2 friends and I went to interview Emmanuel Levinas in Paris. And as was mentioned in the intro, the interview was published under the title The Paradox of Morality, an interview with Emmanuel Levinas. And I'm very proud to say, actually, it's since become my most frequently cited academic work. So if I go down in history as one of the 3 Warwick students who went to interview Emmanuel Levinas, I'm quite happy with that. So I want to talk a little bit about why that interview was of such great interest over time to scholars and general students alike. And to my mind, there are 3 important moments in the interview that explain this. So first of all, and I know some of you here are interested in post-Holocaust Jewish thought, it's one of the very few places where Levinas explicitly discusses the implications of the Holocaust for philosophy and for Jewish thought. And personally, this is really what I focused on in much of my writing about Levinas. Also, I think he explains core ideas in totality and infinity in a remarkably accessible way. But before I say the third thing, I'm looking around and I'm thinking many of you have quite a deep scholarly knowledge of Emmanuel Levinas's work, and many of you, especially I think the graduate students, will have at least a passing familiarity. And you might have been surprised by the title, Levinas and Animal Ethics, and wondering, well, what, first of all thinking, I didn't know that Emmanuel Levinas was interested so much in animal ethics, and secondly, what did he have to say? So in response to the first kind of thought, no, he wasn't really interested. And in response to the second question, what did he have to say? The answer was really not very much. Okay. But we're all academics, so we know how to take a small amount of primary material and turn it into something fun, don't we? Okay, so moving on. The third reason, and actually the biggest reason, that the interview has become such a popular text is that we asked him repeatedly about ethical responsibility towards animals, including posing the question as, do animals have faces in the ethical sense? And there was a great deal of interest in this response because, as I said, it's one of the very few places where he talks about animal ethics. And according to at least some scholars, it is the most important source of his views on animals. So it's this third element that made the interview explode in popularity, particularly when animal ethics became a hot topic in continental philosophy, after the publication of Derrida's The Animal That Therefore I Am. And in 2008, so about 20 years after the original publication, my colleague Peter Adderton suggested that we publish the full text of the discussion of animals in the original interview. And just to give you a little bit of background here, we had sent all of the questions to Levinas in advance. And so when we went there with my, very cheap cassette recorder, this is ancient history, this is 40 years ago, to record his answers, he jumped all over the place because he knew all the questions. So that it was not in any way a simple task to transcribe and then edit and translate the interview. So Peter suggested that we should publish the full text, if not of the whole interview, then of those parts where he talks about animals, and also we had not published it in French, we had only published the English translation of the transcription. Okay, so we did that, and we decided that we wouldn't just publish the interview, but we would ask fellow academics to write articles related to the topic of Levinas and animal ethics. Thank you. I'm looking at the back. I don't know a lot. Oh, Jessica, can you hear? Great, thank you. Okay, so we did that, and this book, as was kindly mentioned in the intro, Face to Face with Animals, appeared in 2019. So I want to give actually a very brief introduction to Levinasian ethics. I don't know how many people in the room will need it, but maybe some of your great Bar-Ilan fans on YouTube will appreciate it. So Levinas is best known for his phenomenologically inspired account of what he calls the face-to-face or ethical relation, which he elaborates at length in his 1961 work, Totality and Infinity. And according to this account, to encounter another person is to become aware of my infinite, inescapable ethical responsibility for the other, without asking about the other's responsibility for me. Hence, he says it is an asymmetrical relationship, and the relationship is what he describes as the absolutely other. In the interview, he talks about a paradox in the encounter with the other. The paradox is that the other appears to me, he says, simultaneously as coming from a dimension of height and from a dimension of humility. The metaphor of height represents the other's moral authority, and the idea of humility represents the other's physical and psychological vulnerability. In the interview, he also dispels a common misunderstanding that plagues his work. When he talks about the otherness or the alterity of the other, he's not talking about simple difference. The alterity of the other is not due to a surface feature like the other's skin color, gender, language, or culture. Rather, the alterity of the other is based on my sense that the other exceeds my power and understanding. Something about the other is always beyond my grasp. He goes so far as to draw on Descartes' meditation on the idea of the infinite and apply it not to God, but to the human other. He basically says that he, with Descartes, says that we finite beings cannot grasp the infinite, and to entertain the idea of the infinite is simultaneously to acknowledge that the idea itself is inadequate. And when I teach this to students, I ask them, and you might do this thought experiment now, whether you're a believer or an atheist or somewhere in between, try to get in your head the idea of God. Think God. Think an infinite God. And then ask yourself, is this idea of an infinite God that I have in my head an adequate representation of that God? Okay, I always try to simplify Levinas. Anyway, so what he says is that to entertain the idea of the infinite is at the same time always to, as part of that idea, to acknowledge that that idea is inadequate. In his words, it's an idea that overflows the thought that thinks it. So that's a brief description of the idea of the face of the other. Do we have any animal lovers in the room? Animal lovers? Yes, great. If you are one, you might maintain that your dog or cat or whatever, parakeet, does indeed have a face in the Levinasian sense. His comments in the interview were more ambiguous. He said, "One cannot entirely refuse the face of an animal. It is via the face that one understands, for example, a dog." Thank you very much. Yet the priority here is not found in the animal, but in the human face. The phenomenon of the face is not in its purest form in the dog. In the dog, in the animal, there are other phenomena. For example, the force of nature is pure vitality. It is more this which characterizes the dog, but it also has a face. So I'll return to the question of what distinguishes humans from other animals in Levinas's thought. But first, I want to just mention that another important aspect of his thought is the relationship between ethics and justice. In his later work, he reserves the term ethics and ethical to describe the face-to-face, and uses the term justice to refer to the systems we need to put in place when there is more than one other for whom we are responsible. Okay, so Levinas and animal ethics. I mentioned that some scholars cite the Paradox of Morality interview as the most important text for understanding his view on animal ethics. But there's another text that is also extremely important, one that had been overlooked in this context until we put together Face-to-Face with Animals. In my contribution to that volume, I cited Levinas's Talmudic commentary, And God Created Woman. It's in his 9 Talmudic commentaries. And this introduces the midrashic idea of the first human being as being created with 2 faces. The proof text, Psalm 139:5, is, quote, "You hedge me before and behind, you lay your hand upon me." The overarching theme of the psalm is that it is impossible to flee from God's presence. Levinas explains the connection between this theme and the image of a being with 2 faces. A being with a single face has a space, the back of the head, for hidden thoughts. But to have a second face is to have nowhere to hide, no possibility of separating oneself from God, and no possibility of avoiding responsibility. And the Talmudic text goes on and quotes Rav Ami, who said, "Behind means the last one created. Before means the first one to be punished." As I'm sure you all know, in the Genesis narrative, humans are the last beings to be created before God rests on the 7th day. And Levinas reads the statement as a comment on the existential situation of the human being. And I'm going to apologize again. I've been working on Levinas for 40 years, and not all of the translations are up to kind of gender equality standards today. So the language is not going to be at all woke. Man has come into an already made universe. Man is the first to receive punishment. It is he who answers for what he has not done. Beyond the realm attributable to his freedom, he is pressed from his front and rear. He is asked to account for things which he did not will and which were not born from his freedom. The last part of this Talmudic text, sorry, I'm checking my timing. The last part of the Talmudic text that is significant for us continues the theme of honors and punishments and the order in which they are distributed. One of the verses cited relates to the flood. God wiped out all the creatures on the face of the earth, both man and cattle. He argues that humanity's punishment is cited before that of the animals in this verse because people are held responsible for all ethical evil. And this is Levinas. Rabbinic tradition and the biblical text agree. The causes for the flood were injustice and the sexual perversion of men and animals, evil from which the other person suffers. For this perverted universe, man answers first. This humanity is defined not by liberty, but by a responsibility prior to all initiative. Man answers for more than his freely chosen acts. He is the hostage of the universe. So I know that many of you are familiar with Levinas's later work, particularly Otherwise Than Being. And for you, this language of hostage will be familiar. Humanity, or the ethical subject, is a hostage responsible for the whole universe. And such responsibility is neither contracted nor chosen, but is prior to the subject's freedom. In the interview, we approach the question of animal ethics from the perspective of the self who encounters the face of another. But this Talmudic commentary of Levinas's gives a different perspective. What does it mean for me to be human? According to this text, as he interprets it, to be fully human is not to be a rational animal or a social animal, but to experience myself as responsible for the universe, to the extent of being responsible for situations that precede my very existence and do not depend on my will. I want to talk now a little bit about the essay that I wrote for that volume about Levinas and animal ethics. And I called it, the main title is, Now We're Talking Pedagogy. So it might be a slightly surprising title. The subtitle is Levinas, Animal Ethics, and Jewish Education. The reference to pedagogy comes from a phrase that he used that didn't make it into the published interview. We asked him, how can atheists learn to welcome the face of the other, or learn ethical responsibility? And his initial response was basically to shrug and exclaim, "Là nous sommes dans la pédagogie." Now we're talking pedagogy. And he declined to engage in that conversation. As Claire Katz has pointed out, unlike many great moral philosophers, he did not write educational philosophy. However, he did write about the philosophy of specifically Jewish education, so I think Bar-Ilan is a good place to talk about that. His focus on Jewish education shouldn't be understood as merely parochial. Throughout his essays, he frequently underscores the universalism of Judaism, and his critique of Western humanism is presented in similar terms in both his philosophical writings and his essays on Judaism. He argues that the humanism modernity produced, which leads us to believe we are each free, autonomous, and hold a privileged place in the sun, led to the cascade of inhumanities we experienced in the 20th century. His philosophical work presents us with an alternative subjectivity. In place of Western humanism's self-centered ego, he proposes a new humanism, at the heart of which we find a subjectivity defined by ceding its egocentric status for the other. In his Jewish writings, however, he shows that such a humanism is not new. It's what he calls a biblical or Jewish humanism of the other man. His writings on Jewish education do not simply elaborate this subjectivity. They explore how such a subjectivity is shaped by Jewish education. A detailed discussion of how he understands Jewish education's role in shaping ethical subjectivity is beyond the scope of this talk, but two passages from his essay, An Adult Religion, are particularly relevant. In the first, he offers an argument that not only the ethical, but also the ritual commandments serve to prepare a person for ethical responsibility. And just before I quote this, Jessica's face happened to catch my eye. It's good to have a really experienced translator in the room, because I'm about to say, if you're reading this essay, An Adult Religion, in the English translation, be very, very careful, because there are a few extremely significant errors. Okay, so I'm reading you a revised translation. Levinas wrote, Jewish ritual law constitutes a severe discipline which leads to justice. Only the one who has been able to impose a severe rule on his own nature can recognize the face of the other. And the second passage suggests that not every regime of discipline will have this ethical effect. He writes, "The way that leads to God therefore leads ipso facto to man, and the way that leads to man draws us back to ritual discipline and self-reflection. Its greatness lies in its daily regularity." Still quoting Levinas, "Here is a passage in which 3 opinions are given. The second indicates the way in which the first is true, and the third indicates the practical conditions for the second." If the text would be familiar to many of you, Ben Zoma said, "I have found a verse that contains the whole of the Torah. Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." Ben Nanos said, "I have found a verse that contains the whole of the Torah. You will love your neighbor as yourself." Ben Pazi said, "I have found a verse that contains the whole of the Torah. You will sacrifice a lamb in the morning and another at dusk." I feel the vegetarians in the room getting a little bit edgy when we say that. Okay. "And Rabbi, their master, stood up and decided the law is according to Ben Pazi." So leaving aside the ethical issues regarding animal sacrifice, the passage illustrates that the daily regularity of ritual practice is enmeshed within a web of moral and religious teaching. The commandment to love your neighbor as yourself might sound more obviously Levinasian to readers of his philosophical work. Yet his comment on the whole text points out that the third opinion, which cites these twice-daily obligations, indicates the practical conditions for the fulfillment of the ethical commandment to love the neighbor. In the commentary toward the other, he again explores the theme of the interrelation between ethics, ritual commandments, and religious teachings in Judaism, suggesting that the ritual commandments and theological teachings are somehow required for the successful transmission of ethical values across the generations. Levinas was very fond of rhetorical questions, so he's going to ask you one. Are we to think that the sense of justice dwelling in the Jewish conscience, that wonder of wonders, is due to the fact that for centuries Jews fasted on Yom Kippur, observed the Sabbath and the food prohibitions, waited for the Messiah, and understood the love of one's neighbor as a duty of piety? Should one go so far as to think that contempt for the mitzvah compromises the mysterious Jewish sense of justice in us? If we Jews, without ritual life and without piety, are still borne by a previously acquired momentum toward unconditional justice, what guarantees do we have that we will be so moved for long? Now, moving back to animals in particular, in the article, I argued that key points in his comments on animal ethics are consistent with Jewish tradition. These include an emphasis on a purportedly clear binary distinction between humans and non-human animals, acknowledgement of a concern not to make animals suffer unnecessarily, and the suggestion that this concern for the suffering of animals is based on an analogy between human and animal suffering. In addition, building on the discussion of Jewish pedagogy as the endeavor to shape an ethical subjectivity, I tried to show that there are resources within the Jewish legal and moral tradition that can be drawn on to shape an increasingly responsible and compassionate approach to animal ethics. So in the interview, immediately after stating that we do not want to make an animal suffer needlessly, Levinas argued that the prototype for this is human ethics. Clearly, he says, one ethics is the transference of the idea of suffering to an animal. Certainly, the animal suffers. It is because we as men know what suffering is that we can also have this obligation. So there are 2 separate ideas that are worth noting in this passage. First, the definitive statement that animals suffer, I would say, is unremarkable within the context of a discussion of Jewish approaches to animal ethics. However, within the history of Western philosophy, the idea is not taken for granted. Jonathan Crane introduced a recent collection, actually it's not that recent anymore because I wrote this a while back. Anyway, Crane introduced a collection of essays on animals as ethical agents with the following critique of Western philosophy. He said, "Long have we humans assumed non-human animals to be lowly creatures of scant intelligence, whose sentience consists only in base and impulsive reactions. In recent centuries, Cartesian thought further severed any ties between the way humans think about themselves and the way they consider non-human animals. Indeed, Descartes viewed animals primarily as automatons, flesh and viscera responding to stimuli with little, if any, cognitive activity. For him, bestial nature shared nothing meaningful with human nature beyond the organic. So at this point, I'm going to check with the audience. In your opinion, is Judaism concerned about animals and shows compassion towards them? Yes, no, not sure. Yes, Judaism cares about animals. No, Judaism doesn't care about animals. Don't know. Okay, so yeah, with academics, they will often tend to go for the more nuanced response, because otherwise we'd all be out of a job, wouldn't we? So that's great. Yeah, so my assumption has been that speaking to a Jewish audience, I don't need to persuade most of you that Judaism is concerned about animals, their well-being, and avoiding their suffering. So the article that I wrote was really focused on, sort of aimed at a secular audience. So I tried to give some indications of where in the Jewish tradition we find concern for animals. And I want to check with my chair because my watch let me down. How are we doing on time?
We have 7 more minutes.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to ask you, actually, I always teach interactively. So if you had to persuade a secular audience that Judaism cares about animals, what evidence would you bring? Think about that for a second while I sip some water. Okay, if we had even more time, we could do this and play bingo. Okay, so I listed a few. I have got the positive obligation to allow domestic animals to rest on the Sabbath, prohibition of cooking a kid in its mother's milk. By the way, I know many of you are Talmudic scholars, and you can argue every single one of these points from 10 different perspectives. But anyway, my list. Okay. Prohibition of taking eggs or chicks from a nest when the mother bird is present, muzzling an ox when it is threshing, plowing a field with animals of different strengths, tethered together. So the rationale for these commandments is subject to debate, but Jewish law ultimately enshrines something like a general principle. The prohibition of tsar balei chayim, literally the suffering of a living being, as a commandment with a status of biblical law. And there are many other aspects of halakha and Jewish thought which we could cite to show that Judaism is concerned with the suffering of animals, including, for example, the rabbinic mitzvah of feeding one's animals before partaking of one's own meal, and the prohibition, according to most authorities, of hunting for sport. Jewish law, as you know, does, however, permit the slaughter of animals for what it would call legitimate reasons, including practical means like food and clothing, ritual reasons such as, here it comes again, animal sacrifices during the temple period, and to safeguard human health and well-being in case of threats from animals. However, Maimonides explains that at least the rules of shechita, ritual slaughter, are designed to minimize the suffering of the animal. Of course, other explanations are offered by different authorities for these rules, but this statement of Maimonides, where he says, so the statement of Maimonides that we do this ritual slaughter out of concern to minimize suffering has become very well known. So finally, according to the creation narrative in Genesis, humans were originally intended to be vegetarian, and divine sanction for meat eating is granted to humanity only after the flood. And the permission itself is given together with restrictions. In another article, my co-author, also my husband, Ian Games, and I have argued that a close reading of the biblical text about Noah sacrificing animals after the flood reveals that God was less than enthusiastic about the idea. And we called that article Divine Disappointments, Humans and Other Animals in the Book of Bereshit. Contemporary advocates of vegetarianism as an authentic expression of Jewish values argue that the restrictions around the consumption of meat, together with the prehistory of harmony between humans and other animals in the Garden of Eden, and the prohibition of causing an animal to suffer, point toward vegetarianism as a morally and religiously preferable way of life. Next, interactive questions. How many vegetarians do we have in the room? Right. So I was checking into the hotel last night and I noticed the clerk's enormous tattoo that said, super vegan. You noticed it as well.
And animal liberation on the other hand,
What was the other one?
Animal liberation.
Animal liberation. I didn't see that one. So we had a really interesting conversation about what it means to be not just vegan, but super vegan. Do you want to tell us? What does it mean to be a super vegan?
He didn't elaborate on that. We got more on the other hand, in liberation.
Basically, he said it means the same thing. So he was one of those people who goes and chains themselves to a fence of a slaughterhouse to stop their work. And he said he stopped them for a whole they stopped for 30 minutes. Okay, super veganism. You see, you learned something today. You already knew all about Emmanuel Levinas, you knew about Jewish tradition and animal ethics, but you might not have known the term super vegan. Okay, so there's several vegetarians and vegans in the room, and both are growing trends in Israel from the research I looked at. But I think it's still unlikely that the majority of Jews worldwide going to abandon Friday night chicken soup. However, a greater understanding of and focus on compassion for animals in Jewish tradition could, I hope, result in significant changes. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to return to the question of pedagogy and consider how Jewish education can contribute to improvements to animal welfare. Levinas' understanding of Jewish pedagogy, and even perhaps of Judaism as a whole, is that it cultivates the development and expression of an ethical subjectivity, of a decentered self, which rather than being egoistic, experiences itself as responsible for the universe. Regardless of whether non-human animals are understood to have faces in the Levinasian ethical sense, this responsibility includes compassionate treatment of animals and the prohibition of causing them unnecessary suffering. Yet for Levinas, this awareness of responsibility for others is not in itself sufficient. And if we had more than 2 minutes, we'd talk about his critique of how Western culture transmits its ideas and how Jewish culture does a better job. But that's a story for another time. Okay, so for Levinas, one of the functions of the daily practice of Judaism's ritual law, which is itself inscribed within the system of texts, teachings, and practices, is to discipline one's spontaneity, preparing oneself to set aside one's egoistic needs and desires for the sake of the other. My discussion of animal ethics in Judaism and in Levinas' thought suggests a further development of this understanding of the commandments. And that would be that the disciplined observance of ritual law should lead to enhanced ethical sensitivity and awareness, both vis-a-vis interpersonal relations and with regard to our treatment of animals. And moral development within either of these spheres should positively impact the other domain. I emphasize the should because I think from looking around the Jewish world, it's not a given that careful observance of ritual law necessarily leads to the most moral, upright, compassionate behavior. But I'm not going to say any more about that. In my ideal world, the more sensitive we become to the vulnerability and suffering of other human beings, the more able we should be to transfer these ideas of suffering to non-human animals. And our concerns for animal welfare should not distract us from, but rather enhance our sensitivity toward the suffering of other people.
Thank you very much for that beautiful presentation. We will first hear Dr. Levy's presentation, and then we'll collect questions for both our speakers. So it's my great honor